Yet again, I'm just going to introduce the moderator of our third panel, which is Salome Viljoen, who will now introduce the other speakers. Take it away.
Sure. Hopefully everyone feels refreshed and revived from the tea break and ready to get back to our final panel, which is going to be Waking Up from the Neoliberal Nightmare, New Property Relations. And to propose all of these exciting new property relations, we have Eduardo Penalver from the University of Chicago School of Law, Rashmi Dyal-Chand from the Northeastern University School of Law, and finally Audrey McFarlane from the University of Baltimore School of Law. Just again, a reminder, it's going to be very conversational, so if you have a statement or a question, just remember to press your microphone so that your statement or question can be recorded for posterity. Do you have a pen? Do you need a pen?
I do need a pen.
Here.
Thank you. I just forgot to bring it.
I would like that pen. Yeah, thank you. So just to start off the discussion, in my 1L property class, I had Professor Bruce Mann.
Okay.
Yeah. We'd sort of did touch on sort of how zoning laws and the history of the federally insured mortgages contributed to and shaped the society that we have. But the conversation sort of finished with, and now we have this financial crisis, right? And kind of left me very much wondering, how can we use the form of law that we have now, or the alternatives that we've been talking about all day here, to sort of shape and address new property relations moving forward, looking at sort of the post-crisis context?
Well, let me make it even worse.
Great.
My work has shown that our system of zoning, but even our notion of property, is premised on inequality, and zoning in particular is premised on the ability to exclude low-income people from living near higher-income people, and that it guarantees that right and sees that as right and okay, and that some of the crises that we've experienced have been what I call inclusion crises, where there have been efforts to include policies that were premised upon including or broadening the scope of people who could call themselves property owners. And nevertheless, you find that you can look at the subprime crisis as a resulting exclusion. So it's almost like the inclusionary efforts within the existing property regime seem to lead to an opposite result.
Although when I think about the zoning story, I mean, this gets at a little bit of my confusion with the way the question's framed, because I see property as sort of a sideshow there. I mean, it seems to me that, I mean, it's motivating, obviously. Like when you talk to people, say in some exclusive suburb, about why they don't want low-income housing in their community, they'll talk about property values, right? They don't want their taxes, the property taxes, to go up because their property values will go down, or they don't want the schools to deteriorate because the property values. But I mean, people use property. I often think I think sometimes that's insincere. So it's just more comfortable to talk about your property value. So in that sense, it's not about property. It's really about not wanting to live near low-income people, or something like that, which they maybe feel less comfortable saying, or people of different race, again, which is not feel less comfortable saying. But it's very bloodless to talk about the value of your property or something. But I don't know that that's really what's animating things. But also, it's like, it's not ownership itself that's doing the work of exclusion there, right? It's zoning as a constraint on the freedom of the owners, right? I mean, why are you zoning? You're zoning because some owner might subdivide their 5-acre parcel in Greenwich and put in low-income housing because it's actually more profitable than having a single home on a 5-acre parcel, right? I mean, that's what you're worried about. That's why you zone. Otherwise, you just let the market take care of it, right? You zone to restrain owners from defecting, right, and allowing low-income people into the community. So so it's zoning and not property, and then it's and then it's not just zoning, but it's who's participating in the making of the zoning law, right? It's the people within that municipality, right? Well, how did that municipality get the boundaries it has? Well, because of the law of local government formation, right? And it allows people to some local majority to establish a municipality that once it's there is very hard to dissolve, that has, under home rule statutes, the power to write a zoning law that keeps low-income people out, right, without any obligation to the metropolitan area within which it's situated or something like that. So it's, it's property's there, but property is kind of on all sides of it, right? I mean, it's, so I think talking about property is really not, I think, when we're thinking about this story, right, how do we end up with a landscape that's segregated by race and income? Properties, yeah, I mean, it's relevant, but it's not I don't see it as the main show.
Although, going back to Salome's question about the crisis, I do think property is much more of a central part of that story.
Well, it's central in the sense that it's central as a kind of object of that story, but I'm not sure that, right? I mean, you find, the subprime crisis happens because people become owners of property that they couldn't afford, because banks are engaged in predatory, often fraudulent practices, right? But and then on the other end, right? So there's both the extension of ownership and then the violation of ownership through fraud, and then on the other side, during the foreclosure and the robo-signing, there's a violation of property rights built into the law of foreclosure, to dispossess people illegally often, right? I mean, so it's, but I don't know that, I guess reimagining ownership, it doesn't get me anywhere when I think about those.
Well, but there's one piece of the story that I think you left out, Eduardo, which I think is really central to the story about property and ownership, and that's at the secondary market level, right? So in the secondary market, that was the financial system really propertizing in a way that that I think started to extenuate our understanding of property and property ownership in such a way that may have led to some of the, I think, some of the anger and existential crisis that we've seen in the room today. And that's not necessarily required, I think, for solving the problem going forward. So in the secondary market, what we saw was such an emphasis on propertization for the purpose of exchange and transfer, right? That the value of the underlying asset for purposes other than exchange was gutted. It was rendered relatively more useless or more irrelevant, and to be able to return to a situation in which we could reinvigorate that concept of property, that use of property, I think would be a meaningful step forward. So that might be one way in which ownership really was more central to the story. Or one reason why ownership was more central to the story in the crisis is distinguished from the story about segregation.
I think property is central to this story, and it's one of the difficulties that we've had in discussing this topic is each term that we're discussing requires extensive definition. So even the concept of ownership, it's really, the issue is what is our definition of ownership? What do we think that you get with that? And I guess the neoliberal critique is that the definition of ownership is that we now have it as it's going to be defined on an individual level, that it can enrich certain individuals at the expense of either a discernible group or kind of our collective sense of, of we. So I think that in terms of the subprime crisis or the mortgage crisis, I think it reflects that definition of ownership kind of going to lengths that we didn't really expect, and going to lengths all the while mouthing inclusionary policies, so that it was for the good of everybody, and it was meant to provide access to credit, access to home ownership in ways that had not been done before. So that's the conundrum, which is how do you respond to that whenever you try to critique it, the response is, yeah, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to accomplish that, and aren't we? So there's a disconnect between the rhetoric and the outcome.
Well, sure, to sort of build off of that, do you think maybe that some of the solutions or some of the possibilities in the law center on maybe changing those definitions? I mean, where do you see as
Definitions of, sorry?
well, ownership, for example, was what Professor McFarlane mentioned, but sort of where do you see the possibilities for addressing these challenges?
You have to address the discourse, and right now, I think we're all a bit hypnotized to even have the language to challenge it. And so a lot of it is obscured through complexity. And so to use another example that's a bit different than the subprime crisis, we have a new financing technique in economic development called tax increment financing. And we actually had an open battle about tax increment financing in Baltimore, which was truly a wonderful thing because usually these things just happen and all kinds of public money gets tied up in furtherance of certain private interests and people are unaware. And there was a effort, we're going to build a new glamorous section of Baltimore. It's going to have an expanded Whole Foods, not just a regular one. And in order to get a state tax credit, they had to change the boundary of what was going to be included in the district for this tax increment financing. And they just changed it a little bit and included a public housing complex in the area. And the public housing complex residents heard about it and came down to the city council to say, hey, what's this development? What are we going to get? And as I watched the hearings and people were up in arms and trying to challenge this tax increment financing, what became clear was how confused people were about what it was. So people got up and said, well, this is HUD money, right? No. Not HUD money. Okay, well, this is state money. Well, no, technically not. And it was so complicated to explain what was going to actually happen, how this tax increment financing was going to be, I guess, financed. And so what a tax increment financing is really borrowing today based on projections for tomorrow, and very rosy, favorable, positive projections. And the city kind of ending up tying all revenues generated from the new development to pay off the bondholders for that new development. And so what I've just done in that explanation is grossly oversimplified and misrepresented what tax increment financing is. And so how do you get people to the point where they can stand up and challenge that when you need experts who design this and it obfuscates what's really going on? So that complexity is part of why this discourse is kind of overwhelming and very difficult to penetrate. And so the first question is what aspects of the discourse do we need to change or can we change?
Any other thoughts on?
I mean, I think you talk about reconceptualizing ownership or something like that. I mean, there is a kind of popular rhetoric of ownership, right, that along the lines of this is mine, I can do whatever the hell with it I want, or something like that, right? And it's mine, and it's about my freedom to direct the use of the things I own, and without regard to any sense of obligation or limitation, right? Now, it's not accurate. I mean, hopefully after first year of law school, that's not true, right? That's not what it means to be an owner. But you can't deny that there's a rhetoric of property rights at work in our political system that maybe we could reimagine. I don't know that means reimagining property the way we understand it. I think, but it's more of a political project, perhaps, right? But even then, the purpose of reimagining property rights, or the rhetoric of property rights, or the rhetoric of ownership, is to create space for something else, right? It's not enough to do that. If property rights are different than the way they're, because the reason people deploy that rhetoric is to limit the ability of people through collective decision-making mechanisms to make changes in distribution of property or to regulate the use of property towards other ends. The point of changing the rhetoric of property rights in our political process is not directly to get at those goals that we want by virtue of the impact that will have on property, but to free up, right, space for collective decision-making about property, among other things, right? Even there, I think it's only indirectly related to the kinds of goals that we seem to have in mind, or what I've been listening to.
I'm gonna ask you a question, Eduardo, if I may.
Yeah.
So yes, and arguably, addressing property relationships is a way to do that, right? That even if the goal is ultimately outside of property, one way in which to try to push that change is to address it through property relationships.
For example.
So, well, one example would be civic republicanism, right? Where we use property rights as a way, we use the mechanism of property rights as a way to push political change and political collective decision making. Another way, of course, is to do it through a mechanism like commons ownership or worker-owned cooperatives.
Yeah.
But the question for you is,
but is that really a change in the way I mean, that's a change in the particular structure of ownership that something's employing, right? But is that a change in our, I mean, a lot of these things, they're sort of implicitly invoking the same concept of ownership, right?
Not the Demsetzian concept, however, right? If we say ownership is defined by both Demsetz and Ostrom, the whole spectrum, then yes.
Right, that's it, yeah.
Okay, but I think that's something about which we've had some disagreement in the room this morning. So yes, in that case, yes. But what about the idea of redistribution or pre-distribution, as Ezra mentioned earlier today, as a jumping off point? That would be a more specific invocation of property rights, right? That I think would require messing with the property system in a way.
Do you think that the property, what do you mean by that? I mean, because I don't see property law, right? So I don't see the law of property, right, as the main obstacle to redistribution in the United States or elsewhere. I mean, I don't know enough about other legal systems, but in our system, right, I don't think the takings clause, if we're going to include that within the law of property, constitutional law of property, I don't think, certainly not the common law of property, right, stands in the way of the state, redistributing however kind of redistribution you favor through progressive taxation and transfer payments or whatever. I mean, property law is not the problem. The problem is the lack of any kind of political impulse in that direction. I don't see, if the state tried to do it, I don't think that there would be some legal obstacle, right, to increasing the highest marginal tax rates and,
right.
I mean, imposing some steep inheritance tax. What's the legal barrier? There's no
Right.
legal barrier.
Just to comment on this piece of the conversation, I think what you're seeing is Eduardo really using a very capacious definition of property, which I think, relatively speaking, the three of us share perhaps more than others in the room, and that's something to put our finger on. That there is within, I think, our collective understanding of property law a sense that there are mechanisms, within it to be able to accomplish some of these very goals. Audrey.
You're saying we need to talk about some sticks in the bundle.
We could talk about it that way.
I don't know. I don't think that wasn't my. I wasn't saying that the tools for redistribution are already. I think there are tools. I mean, that's my capaciousness. But I think that even with a kind of pretty traditional conception of what the content of the law of property is, and you don't need to reimagine that to have redistribution. I mean, you just need, we have a Congress, we elect our representatives. They vote for, to raise the
Yeah.
highest marginal tax rate, or to tax this or that kind of financial transaction, whatever. I mean, they could do that, and someone wants to bring some challenge on the basis of some property-based claim to that action, they're going to lose. But it's never going to happen. I mean, it's not going to happen, right? But the reason it's not going to happen is it's not going to be because of the law of property. It's going to be because I don't even think it's going to be really the rhetoric of property rights.
But maybe redistribution is a bit too difficult, or, it's a straw man in the sense that it's easy to say, well, that's too huge to accomplish. But if we start to think in stages of who is it we're trying to include, well, first of all, what is it that we think property gives, and why do people seek it out? Why is it so popular? Why is it endured for so long? And it's a way that people crave. They view it as providing material stability for them, certain predictability and control. And so it fulfills the aspect of humans that want to control. And we have a concept of it, it's very individualized, but it fulfills certain needs. And so we think it's a good thing, and we've at least espoused a rhetoric for quite a while that we want it to be those rights and ability and control over land and things to be extended to a wide range of people. And that's considered to be the underlying justification for a society that is partially, or holds itself out to be democratic. And so you have to kind of look at, is that goal being fulfilled? And what role does property play as an obstacle to that goal being fulfilled? So back to the mortgage crisis, which was an attempt to fulfill that vision through individual home ownership, through credit. So, query as to whether or not you are a owner, but we've decided you are. And how well were people able to retain that control and ownership of property and secure well-being? So the people who are in a position to at least take advantage of that, how well did that work out? And there really is an indictment of whether or not the property regime as currently conceived was able to fulfill that. And in part, one of my arguments has been that property has been seen as fulfilling a policy of protecting markets, and that underlying policy has allowed us to conceive of alienability and transfer in ways that are so fluid that it may be detrimental to certain people. So those are certainly things that we can start to rethink about. If we think there's a bit too much fluidity, or if we think there's a bit too much exploitation or predatory behavior, what can we do within existing doctrine to address that?
There is a comment from the audience. Yeah.
I'd like to ask the panel to clarify what you see is at stake here. And it strikes me from the conversation is that there's proposals for problems in the existing property regime, and then policy implications and tweaks to that. And if that's the case, then it's towards what end? And from what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's for a more equal system. But I don't think that's really what we want. We're not really after egalitarianism. So to take this to an extreme, that you would call for Sparta, right, where we all sleep in the same barracks and wear the same tunics. But that's not what we want. Not what we value. I would propose that what we really want is more freedom, freedom to pursue our goals, to empower ourselves. And if that's the case, if we conceive this as the end goal for what we want in our society is greater freedom, then how does that implicate what we're talking about in terms of property here?
Freedom to do what?
Well, freedom for ourselves. It's just.
Is this after you've had food and shelter and all those things?
It's also freedom to pursue these things, right? So greater economic and educational opportunities in order to empower ourselves collectively and individually.
Okay.
Do you want to? I think there are a couple more questions, so maybe we'll just take a few. Max, you had a question?
Yeah, this is, I guess, on a different track, but I think it'd be really helpful to me to hear your reflections as property law scholars and contributing to producing a sort of internal legal discourse that maybe hasn't really been exported outside the legal academy that much. That it seems to me that Professor McFarlane, your comment initially about how sort of lay people don't often understand the way that the law works, or they have really incredible misconceptions about the way that the law works, and that includes a lot of the times the way that property law works. I guess I would want to ask the three of you to sort of say more about that. Are there major misconceptions? Do you think that people, particularly in left social movements or radical social movements, do they have misconceptions about the way the law or property law works? And what are the sort of things that maybe you think the legal academy or you as scholars or maybe radical legal scholars should be or would say to those people, lawyers, should say to those people who are pursuing strategies about sort of what they need to do to better take into account the way the law actually works?
And Derek, do you want to go ahead?
So kind of to follow up on that, but also just to make an independent sort of request, which you could freely disregard. I think that in this room, maybe there's less of a concern with what might be the constitutional barriers to a change in property law, or sort of a strictly sort of doctrinal analysis of what sort of property law could be, but almost as a political project, how one might think about reorienting the sticks in the bundle of property that you would still call the same institution of property that you're familiar with, but would function in practice in daily life socially quite differently. And in particular, that could happen through a state legislature. But to take the example of redistribution, the legislature might decide to do it through a progressive tax and transfer scheme. They might also decide to do it by limiting equity, like something that came up earlier in the day, that you don't necessarily reap all the equity gains when you sell out from a piece of property. And so that is just one example of a way to think about property a little differently. Maybe limiting equity could be a way to actually kind of change property around the edges that would have a sort of political function and serve as sort of what we earlier called pre-distribution effect. But my request is simply to kind of think about property a little bit from including kind of a capacious political sense as well of what might be done.
Mm-hmm. And in the back, did you have a comment? No.
Just on Eduardo's question to Rashmi, I had an example that I wanted to throw out, which is maybe using property to generate the political will. And so the two examples I have thought of for that, one is the one, Greg's paper on land reparations. And even if you might be opposed to it as a rule, you might still favor it, the push for it, because of the political will it might generate. Or another example would be for Indians. And then the other example would be school boundary settings. So if you delinked homes from your location from which schools you could go to, somewhat similar to the new No Child Left Behind's opt-out possibilities, but extending into the suburbs, that sort of change, even if you didn't want it to happen, could generate the political will you wanted for those.
I agree with, but I don't, that second one's not a change in property, right? That's some districting rule, right? But that's exactly that would have a huge impact, but it's not that's why I think the game is often elsewhere. When I try to think about,
I've got an example for you. Are you ready? So this is one that one of my students in my seminar, Christos, raise your hand. It was such a great seminar. We were studying community economic development together over the winter quarter, and he's going to be very, very familiar with it. And indeed, he and the other students in the course were the ones who pushed me to think about property for this purpose. And do we have internet? Can we pull it up? Never mind. We don't appear to. It's the example of the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative here in Boston, in Roxbury, which the students in the seminar, I'm giving them full credit for this, felt very convinced, and may have convinced me, was such a successful example of community participation in neighborhood redevelopment, of joy, right? Oh, I'm not supposed to use that word. Of ecstasy, of communication, of political participation, et cetera, that began with the granting by the city of Boston to this nonprofit organization of the power of eminent domain, which they then used to acquire something like 130, no, not that many, but fewer than 100, but quite a large number of vacant lots throughout the neighborhood. And then they redeveloped that land into affordable housing units, which was managed by a cooperative, right? So it was which of course invokes the commons. So it was an unbelievable example of, relationships in a neighborhood managed through the medium of property, right? Which arguably began with a pre-distributive move, in which property was acquired by this organization and then jointly managed. So I would say, Eduardo, that would be, right? That would be one example of you're exactly right, not a change in property law unless you see this unique granting of eminent domain power as some sort of change in property law. But really, the use of property law and its management for the purpose of accomplishing something other than what we might think of as neoliberal goals.
Yeah.
And I think that's also a response to the last question as well as Ezra's argument. And if I could just add a couple of responses to the other two questions, since my co-panelists are pausing. I would say that actually one of the major misconceptions that the left has about the way property law works is exactly what the three of us have been talking about to a certain extent, which is that there's this sense of Demsetzian ownership as the fundamental model, right, of property, full stop in this society, and that absolutely plays right into neoliberalism. And so that's in some ways what progressive property scholars have talked about, and what Ezra, I think, has quite meaningfully pointed out should still not be the full extent of the conversation, but simply to broaden that conception from just an individual ownership model to one that incorporates notions of the commons and so on is one powerful way in which to push back against misconceptions that liberals have. The other is the idea that property law has a remedial function that is going to inevitably result in dispossession. And here Audrey and I actually might have some basis for disagreement. And here I would just say that one of the really hidden and amazing beauties of property law is that we don't have to rely for remedies only on the granting of monetary damages. That the courts of equity and the common law system have given us the gift of the possibility of injunctive relief. The transfer of land, right, as a means of remedying harms experienced within and through property, and that can be that's something I think that progressives and liberals often forget, that can be a basis for I guess redistribution, but also the creation of more equitable relationships in property that I think is completely underexplored and should be explored more. And just on the issue of freedom, I don't think that's what, as a normative matter, I don't think that's what the property law system and liberals should necessarily be working on primarily. I do think it's about inequality and creating more equality within the system. But to what end?
I mean, I think he's right now towards the end of inequality is a problem because of the lack of freedom in people who, right? I mean, don't you think that? I mean, we want people to own because of the things that we think property does for people, right? And
well, okay, so that here again, I think we reach a definitional problem, and I figured we would as soon as we started talking about freedom, where if the question the question is how much regulation is required once that greater level of freedom is achieved.
Oh, sure.
On a very broad level, I can agree that equality is too general a principle, not helpful in any meaningful way, and that freedom certainly is better to the extent that I understand it is. for all people, regardless of circumstances, to be able to reach their full potential and exercise agency. Who can disagree with that? Unless they want to exercise the agency in a way that takes away something of theirs that you want. And so perhaps the political question is where I might end up agreeing with Eduardo, that in the sense of, well, property is, kind of fixed and hard to change, and you are certainly free politically to kind of agitate around different things that you may find dissatisfying. The radicalism in it is that to the extent that the ability to own property and exercise it as a way of, use it as a way of exercising influence and power has been historically not as effective for people who are poor, and particularly people who are non-white. And I'm thinking of, the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. I'm thinking of the people who have transformed the South Bronx by fighting against the housing department to say, no, we are not just objects sitting here, but we're subjects. We have a vision for our neighborhood, and we're going to fight for it. So to the extent that you stand up and say that we should have a say and have an outcome that creates some kind of community that reflects our vision, that is, where the politics comes in. Because I would say that, cities are organized around that particular constituency being silent and being passive, and that whatever they have is free to take. So that is within this system, a radical act for them to speak and act. One of the limitations I find is that the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative truly is the bellwether, the best example of on-the-ground participatory development. But in terms of replicating it, one of the pet peeves I've always had is, and one of the things that people haven't focused on, is that Dudley Street may have been successful because of particular people coming along at a particular time and a historical moment, but also that there was a small foundation that worked with them quietly for 10 years with no benchmarks or reports that they could issue as to the success. And so a lot of this work tends to be carried out with private foundations funding it, and somebody needs to, if you're not seeking a grant from a private foundation, someone needs to speak to them about how they have become corporatized and focused on benchmark setting and show us results, show us what you're going to fix, show us what you're going to solve. Because some of these property-based movements are long, slow, simmering projects that take a long time and are not glamorous or pretty along the way. And so to the extent that there's anyone who is interested in this and the type of support that you need to show, I think that there's been a glaring dearth of that kind of support.
Carl, you had a question or a comment?
Also, I want to remind our panelists, speak into the mics a little bit more, maybe just because we need to get it on the recording. I wanted to pick up a point about zoning, because I thought that was such a great example of how massively property rights, what we think of as the sort of lay definition of private property rights, are restricted by zoning. There's this entire overlay of public power that is local public power that drastically restricts what people can do with their property. And I want to sort of connect that to Max's question about the relationship to left social movements and left politics, and then also to the previous panel. And the suggestion was raised that maybe in the future we're fighting for requires going to a lot of meetings. And I think maybe some of those meetings are already happening. It's the planning board, that meets all the time. There's public meetings about all sorts of little micro rules that happen in our municipalities where we live, and we're just not going to those meetings. And who does go? The developers go. The developers hire lawyers who are lobbyists to go to those meetings. And so I know that this is maybe a sort of sounds mundane, but one of the things that it seems to me left people can do is go get really involved in all of that stuff that's happening all around us that we just is maybe too boring to take notice of? I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, there's a whole theory of local government behavior in the zoning context that focuses not on, it's really on, so it depends on where we're talking about, right? So if we're talking about the city of Boston, it looks a little different than if we're talking about, I don't know the geography here, but some small, well, maybe Cambridge is too big, but about half of Americans live in pretty small municipalities that are on the outskirts of big cities rather than in big cities or in the countryside. And within a municipality of, let's say, under 100,000 people, is largely made up of suburban residential and commercial land uses. The primary mover and shaker in shaping the zoning code and enforcing the zoning code is going to be the homeowner, not the developer. And it's actually, so it's an interesting thing that, right, in New Jersey, when they're trying to combat exclusionary zoning, one of the ways they do it is by empowering developers to sue, to block exclusion, because the interests of the developer are often lined up more with the interests of low income, not perfectly, and there are problems with the builder's remedy in New Jersey, but it's not that developers are running roughshod over the political process, that homeowners are kind of dominating local government lawmaking and zoning. And you can go to the meetings. You probably won't be able to vote because you're not, or you won't have much influence because you're not a homeowner in that or a resident of that municipality. And so the problem is the way that the local government lawmaking is sort of structured in our. I mean, if I could change one thing, and it's not a property thing, I would change local government law. I would change, how I would probably wipe the slate clean and change how boundaries are drawn. Because I think that would do far more good than tweaking something within the law of private ownership. But I do have problems with there are areas in property law where I disagree with most of the jurisdictions in the United States. The one that comes to mind, and I'm not sure how big an impact this has because I'm not sure how big an impact it's had in New Jersey, is the law of trespass, where I think New Jersey gets it right and I think everybody else gets it wrong. But then when I look at New Jersey, I just don't see a huge difference in terms of how it looks. Then it's an interesting actually. Question why they adopt a view of trespass law that's radically different from everyone else, and yet things seem to work basically the same way there, except that you can count cards in the casinos. Mm-hmm. I mean, that seems to be the biggest difference. But it's just for the. I mean, in New Jersey, if you open your property up to the public, you're not allowed to exclude people unless they're somehow interfering with the use to which you've put the property. Where in everywhere else in the country. If you open up your property to the public, you reserve the right to exclude people for whatever reason you see fit. So it's, the soup Nazi, if you don't order the soup right, you can get kicked out. In New Jersey, you have to somehow be disruptive in terms of how you're ordering the soup to be kicked out. And, but it doesn't seem to make much of a difference on the ground. But I do think the law of local government is huge and an engine of huge injustice in our society. I mean, the transmission of opportunity, happens in part through the transmission of actual property, right, from one generation to the next, but probably well before that, because most people inherit property when they're about 40, when their parents die. Some get it earlier, but most people when they're about 40, by then, opportunity's been transmitted from one generation to the next through schooling and housing and the security that provide to the young people. By the time you're 40, a lot of the privilege of your parents has been transmitted to you, and local government law plays an enormous part in that. But nobody ever takes it. I teach land use, and I always get it's too boring for people. I get 30 people. Everyone wants to take corporations and constitutional law and taxation. Nobody wants to take local government law, but it's very, very important and not well understood at all. On the left or the right. Well, actually, no, the right gets local government law.
Right. I'm an acolyte of Jerry Frug, and he was my model for teaching local government law until I had one of those awakenings one year recently where I realized I was teaching local segregation law, which was, it's all about why things can't change, why allocations of rights and privileges are limited and fixed the way they are. So I haven't returned to it for a while.
It is depressing. It's very depressing. But I really, it could change. You just have to change the scale at which you're mobilizing, right? So you're not going to be able to change local government law by showing up at the zoning board meetings, but you change local government law by mobilizing at the state level and kind of, you do some. There are places where this happened. It happened in Oregon, kind of, not perfectly, but where the state came in and took over a significant part of land use lawmaking. But that.
I mean, there are efforts. I mean, the buzzword now is in recognition on the parts of some grassroots activists is that they need to mobilize regionally and that it's defining your interests within local government boundaries, which has been the disempowering part. And so there's kind of work going on in terms of people trying to figure out how to find commonalities across boundaries and across different communities. So I've seen some of that going on in the Baltimore region.
Derek, do you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I have a question. So in local government law, and I took Jerry Frug's, one of the ideas that was kind of appealing in terms of a potential reform was kind of in this line of cases. I mean, I guess you could even group in like Marsh v. Alabama, but thinking about whether we have a right to use certain space as a public space, and that it ends up hinging a lot on who owns the space as a matter of property law. And if we started to ask a different question, what kind of space is it? And I mean, you're talking about that in New Jersey. That's an issue. I mean, it seems like a lot of and I guess I just
don't see the difference it's made in New Jersey. I mean, you have the right to leaflet and non-disruptively picket in a New Jersey shopping mall. But it just hasn't, I mean, you have that right. I mean, the court has the New Jersey Supreme Court is not what it once was. And so they've backed off that a bit. But I don't see how it's fundamentally changed New Jersey's politics, really. I mean, and California also, you have a right to hand out leaflets in shopping centers. And I agree with you. I love that whole body of case law. I'm a big fan of Marsh and Logan Valley. But, and there's obviously implications for labor organizing and things like that. If you could get into the property, right, to organize unions right, if they couldn't exclude you from the shop floor, right? I mean, that would maybe make some difference to. But there are probably a lot of other interventions you could make in labor law to make.
Extend the analysis though much further, and it becomes extremely radical. I think that if we say the way that the space is used doesn't depend that much on who owns it, but on what function it should serve socially.
Yeah, I agree.
That could be a really radical move, and maybe we're not even prepared to take it, but it's within property law, and it's just...
Yeah. Well, because to the extent that you call it private property, then the conversation is over. And
well, no, I don't think that's not necessarily. I think that's the point, right? That it doesn't have to be.
Well, but
it doesn't have to be, but I think that the rhetoric and the understanding, you could say the Demsetzian understanding of ownership is that once it's privatized, then the question of any public obligation, public role, public need
Zuccotti Park is privately owned, right? I mean, that's
I have a question. I have a question for the previous panel. We reconstitute the previous panel for a second. Why haven't people in New Jersey taken advantage of that difference in law? Right? Why don't we? Ezra, you're giving me such a funny look. Why don't we?
I was going to give an example that seemed an interesting one, but it's not New Jersey. Like one of the offshoots of the protests that started last summer in June in Brazil, in Rio and Sao Paulo, it started about transport strikes. One of the offshoots that started later in the fall was what they called a rolezinho. It's like taking a stroll. And so mostly black kids from the favelas would go to the shopping malls and walk through the shopping malls, which sent them into a tizzy. Right. And they ended up having to close the shopping malls for several days because of the threat of, they weren't going to buy anything. They were just, I'd say, displaying their blackness is essentially what they were doing. But they were also their poverty. And that seems like, I mean, I don't know if Jersey can organize such a thing, but that seemed like a really ingenious and powerful thing. And I think it was about property. Like, I'm a little bit perplexed about the difference between this panel and the last one, where, like, I'm all for, and I don't see any conflict about government restrictions on the use of property and also then using legal tactics to redistribute in some ways or other. But property itself, isn't property itself about inequality? Isn't property itself about keeping the rich rich and the poor poor? Or am I misunderstanding that? That's sort of what it seems to me. Like, okay, but what am I not getting? Because I know I'm not a law type,
Property is, oh, no, go ahead, Raj.
No, I was just going to say, I think you have embraced the fetishism that Duncan was talking about.
I fully admitted that.
That's, and I don't think we have. I mean, I think we all three teach first-year property law, and I think we work very hard. I hope it's okay that I'm speaking for the two of you, to not do that, to avoid that. It's not that we're saying that there's an alternative property regime, there's an alternative, story, what did he call it? An alternative to property, but rather that it's really not about the coherence, right, and the Demsetzian version of property that you just articulated. It's not about preserving inequality. Only.
Doesn't it sound like a forest and trees kind of thing too?
Society, you would still have property.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
You have to, because among the functions there would be a lot of problems in a perfectly egalitarian society in terms of getting people to show up for work. But so there's these incentive structures, and okay, that's the inequality connection. But even in a perfectly egalitarian society, you're gonna have property because you need to know, is this my coffee cup or yours? Can I drink out of this? Personal property, real property. In Cuba, 90% of homes are privately owned. So it's you need the property serves a coordinating function in addition to its incentivizing function, and so you can isolate that function, right? And so you can imagine property that's not about inequality. It's about organizing affairs in a way that, so when Aquinas talks about, and building on Aristotle, talks about why we have private ownership, he's writing in a tradition in which that's very suspicious of private ownership, right? I mean, the Christian church, through the Middle Ages, it sees property as a sign of human sinfulness and failure. It's asking things in terms of, is this permissible? Is this inconsistent with, this Locke is in this tradition too, it's inconsistent with God's original plan of universal communal ownership, right? That's the perfect situation. And why do we have private ownership? Is it allowed? And Aquinas gives a couple different explanations, but one of them is, that things work more smoothly when I know what's mine and what's yours. We don't get into conflict about what I'm responsible for and what you're responsible for, and that's a coordinating function. It has nothing to do with inequality, I think.
There are a lot of hands up. Sarah's had hers up for a long time.
I had one comment.
Okay, go ahead.
I think that's a very provocative question, and you can't answer it so property, we now talk about it as a template for relations, for management, for wealth distribution, and it's a template that you kind of put onto your society, and then how it works out depends on what actually happens. So when the country was founded, what did property mean? It meant people as property. It meant few landholders, few people with all the property. So when the protections in the Constitution were put in place, it really was intended, Madison intended to protect the interests of the property holders, and he had a specific group in mind, and he also meant land as well as people. So taking that original arrangement, moving it forward, you still now have these rules that have been created to manage, but different policies are now being fulfilled by those rules. And it just looks a different way depending on the time. So you can't look at these rules in abstract. You have to look at, well, what does that mean? Who is making use of these rules? Who does it benefit? Who is actually taking advantage? So the reason why we can have this discussion is because of the policy decision in the 30s to make financing available for people to obtain, which were what were originally, 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom houses And so that they could now call themselves the property owners, which would have been, unthinkable beforehand. So we had a certain democratization of it, and we now have a lot of buy-in for it, regardless of inequities that it freezes in place or inequities that it exacerbates. But one of the issues that I focus on is the ability to hold on to that property is something that we also need to look at as well, that you can make it available and that people have this now. Certainly, we have a system of acquisition where you can acquire this property. But my question is can you really hold on to this property as a poor person? And that's really in doubt in light of a number of issues like unemployment, but market mechanisms, the porousness of the system and susceptibility to exploitation. And so those are questions that are built in. So I would say it says too much to say that property is about maintaining inequality. I don't think you can answer that except for your local circumstances.
All right, Sarah.
So working off of that comment exactly, I think for me, someone in my late 20s and many of my contemporaries who are, within 10-year span of me up or down, it's more like we're waking up to the neoliberal nightmare related to property rather than waking up from it. I think as we reach an age where we begin to think about what our parents have, what our grandparents had versus what we were able to access or acquire or share or whatever we decide to do, there seems to be just a desperation about our ability to be even part of the landed gentry.
So what do you see as the obstacles? I'm curious. So just what do you identify as the obstacles?
So I think there are a lot of folks of my age in the room. So I can give my basic sense. But before I do that, I also just wanted to acknowledge that I think the conversation now among my group of friends is not about excitement about owning a home, but it's about, this forced co-construction of meaning about what is it going to look like to grow up in a place where we may not ever be able to purchase a home, related to school debt, for instance, related to an unwillingness to participate in sort of a predatory scheme, related to a sense that maybe it isn't practical or really worth our resources to invest in a two-person domestic household. I love the conversation about breaking down the family as contained in this larger conversation about property. But I think it's also a sense of sort of obscurity through, that things are obscured through complexity, as we were chatting about beforehand. And I think if there's a future for me and my contemporaries, many of us, it's sort of obscurity be damned. We have to figure out a way to live in a way that helps us access each other as a good rather than a home ownership. We have to build equity through our shared relationships. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a really personal challenge, I think, to folks of my generation that we're facing in relationship to what a neoliberal nightmare concretely is going to mean for property relations for a generation that's in past decades would have been the ones acquiring property. So I don't know if my contemporaries agree or disagree, but that's something very bringing the conversation really down.
But
to
I'm
a
still
point.
confused because I'm confused whether you're troubled that you can't access ownership or that you just don't want to access ownership. I mean, that's what your conception of what
both,
you aspire
right?
to. So okay.
So I think it's both. So I think.
And then what is neoliberalism? How does this connect to that? I don't know. I don't even know what the term means. So I'm very confused by the term neoliberal. So what do you mean by that?
So I think I've spoken enough, but I would throw that out there to the panel or to others to continue the conversation.
I think there are a lot of other hands up. Yes?
Well, to the extent that property ownership seems to be tied up with dominating the polity and policy making, it may not be intrinsic to property law, but it certainly seems to be an inherent towards using property as capital to increase one's gains, both in terms of more property and profit, as well as dominating the policy. So in some ways, I find the distinction that some of you are making is not very persuasive or convincing. Okay, the other more popular democratic forms of property ownership are possible, but we know how vulnerable they are politically. And moreover, let me just make a separate point. I'm not sure that property law is the only effective way to allocate rights or delineate the two. There's a conflation going on here between household and private property and, say, corporate property, which is a whole different ballgame and arguably more important. So I just wanted to put those points forward.
And then, yeah, you've had your hand up for a while.
So, Audrey, I really thought your points earlier about how people are sort of permanently disenfranchised from real estate ownership and locking them into poverty because most Americans' wealth comes from owning a house is significant. And also I thought what you said about obscurity through complexity and how developers and people with capital and are able to hire very smart people to figure out how to use that to their advantage. So I'm sort of wondering if to wake up from the neoliberal nightmare, right? Because we're not going to change it. Maybe one way to do it is to create communication tools for the basic community to understand with proposed regulations how that'll impact them in a way that's very, very simple. So, for example, somebody told me shortly after I moved to Cambridge that the laws in Massachusetts were changed by a Rockefeller who financed educating voters as they were going into the booths what laws would work for them. And that led to the changes that have made Massachusetts so different from the rest of the country. And so perhaps we could do that on a similar level, like I'm immediately thinking of my friends at Code for America out in San Francisco, if we could create a way of modeling very complex structures. I mean, that's how the financial crisis of 2008 happened, was that you could create an unbelievably sophisticated CDS products that even the regulators couldn't understand. And so it's that method which is sort of, I think, is sort of enabling the plutocracy in America and destroying the middle class. And so if we were to really try to do something, perhaps it would be to give people, to break this sort of asymmetric information that is now becoming so prevalent in our culture and is really, I think, the exact opposite of what America really stands for.
I think maybe, can we just grab a couple more questions before, if you guys can keep notes. Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry to ask you to do this, but can you just briefly summarize the Demsetzian notion of property? Because that's been a barrier to me understanding some of what's been said.
Well, I wonder if it's synonymous in many people's minds with the neoliberal understanding of property as well, right? This idea that, so let me just first ask, do we also need to summarize what Ostrom's understanding of property was as well? Okay, so I feel like I need the chalkboard. So there's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
You guys have to help.
You're teaching at Harvard.
I'm teaching at Harvard, says Audrey. Okay.
Yeah, you can push that up.
This is great because I can jump on one of my soapboxes too, right? So this is Demsetz, and this is arguably Ostrom, both economists. And what Demsetz really argued in a very influential paper was that that this is the only way in which to achieve efficiency in the market, right? That to have an individualized system of ownership would allow individual owners to garner the most surplus from the use of their property, the ownership of their property. So it was really an argument, for example, that I think he actually began with an example of indigenous ownership that was more in the nature of the commons, and for trapping rights, right? And argued that was an example of a market that really wasn't functioning as efficiently as it could, and by fully individualizing ownership of property that you could then achieve the greatest efficiency. The modern manifestation, arguably, of that argument is Henry Smith's argument about information costs. There are differences, but it's on that same spectrum of, so this is Henry Smith, who actually does teach at Harvard, right? And on the other end of the spectrum is the commons, the idea of being able to own in a commons form and be able to participate in use and management of a property in that kind of form. And there's all this in between as well that we really haven't talked about much today, and that there's so much room to discuss if we're talking about alternatives to neoliberal understandings of property relations.
So, yeah, let's talk about those.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about
Let's talk
neoliberalism.
about those.
I actually have no idea, so I'm just going to guess about what you guys are talking about, this collective of Unbound. And I'm going to assume. Do you want to? Who's?
I could give.
Neoliberal just about
I just did a very short.
do it.
I mean,
That would be
it's.
great.
I think it's generally thought
I'd
of
much rather
as a strategy of capital involving deregulation, privatization, and destruction of welfare structures.
Right,
And more or less. So it's not capital as such. It's often linked to either starting with Thatcher Reagan or starting with in Chile in the 70s, and that. So it's a strategy within capital that's. And I can give you the history of the term if you want to, but that doesn't probably matter.
So it's the encapsulate in law.
Yeah.
No, that sounds right. And to me, that has nothing to do with property law, except it has to do with an idea of ownership, right? That doesn't correspond to the law of property.
Unless you define it.
Unless you redefine what.
Unless you define it.
And it's why the term. It's why the term confuses me, because it's not. I feel like it's being used interchangeably with even here. I mean, even individual ownership, right, in our system, it doesn't restrain regulation. It doesn't. The law of individual ownership does not restrain regulation. What restrains regulation is the political system, right? It's the politics, right? And the state not regulating. Right, but that has consequences for what owners can do, but that's not the law of ownership that's dictating that. That's all. That's kind of my.
To go back to the local land use example, how we define individual ownership determines who can vote. So what would a zoning board decision look like in, for example, in like a commons example?
Well, it's usually
what was
residency, not
ownership?
ownership.
Who has voting rights in that example?
It's usually residency and not ownership. So you can be a renter and vote. And again,
Well, the debate has been structured by the rules that we have in place, so it wouldn't affect the land use hearing at all, because the rules that are in place have already defined things based on this individual ownership. It's defined what public policies we think land ownership should serve, and that's why we regulate it heavily. And so.
But you see how this is the flip side, right? This is not neoliberal, because this is regulation of land ownership, right, that generates the exclusion here. It's zoning is regulation of land. It's not the state abdicating or deregulating.
So I just want to very quickly on the neoliberal relationship with law. When I was talking to Duncan Kennedy before this event, one of the things that he said that I think is instructive here and that sounded true to me is that when we're talking about neoliberalism as a mode of governance and an elite discourse and a policy program, sometimes the people who are the sort of spokespeople for it speak in terms of the sort of rigid individual ownership. They tend to, go all the way to the dem sets, but they have lawyers, and their lawyer allies know, like they went to school, and had property. They've read Hofeld, they understand. And so there are lots of I think we as Unbound, we're always kind of struggling to get our left allies who aren't legally inclined to understand that sort of the political fight goes down all the way in the law, all the way down to the tiny little fine-grained rules. And so neoliberalism is this edifice. I don't think it's an edifice in its legal context that is just on the dem set side that we can then break down. I think the neoliberal project just in urban development over the past 30 years has been executed at a very fine-grained level with a lot of legal sophistication that totally is operating in that middle spectrum there.
Give us an example.
Well, I would say the tax incentives seeking to attract corporations and, the arrangements that are made, and there's this sense that whatever the corporations want, that's what we do in order to fulfill their needs.
All of development strategy after the sovereign debt crisis in the 1980s, like the Washington Consensus development strategies that told countries that if they wanted to develop, they needed to attract companies, they needed to privatize state enterprises, they needed to open themselves up to foreign investment.
Right, but I'm interested in the urban example as well. When you say some of the urban development that's been done has been done in the name of this middle space and is still neoliberal.
In the name of the middle space, but the toolbox that is that middle space is...
Such as warranties of habitability, you mean? I mean, give us an example.
Such as public-private partnerships.
Like Kilo, you know, because it's, but Kilo is, so it's the corporations sort of appropriating the power of the state, right? I mean, that's not deregulatory, right? That's,
exactly.
That's I think, I mean, when this back and forth, you know, state-owned enterprises are still property. I mean, that's, I guess this is a kind of category. I mean, we're just looking at this through different lenses because I'm a property lawyer, so the state owns a utility, that's the state's property, and then we participate in ownership decisions through the political process, right, hopefully, but that's property. That's why I say property in the most in Soviet Russia, there was property, right, it was state-owned enterprises, and I mean, it's, and then they privatized it after, right, the fall of Soviet Union, but they changed the ownership structure, but there's ownership always.
I do think it's significant that Ostrom did change the title of her organization from the International Association of Common Property to the International Association for the Study of Commons. And I think, in other words, opening up the boundaries of the discourse beyond property law.
Oh, sure, because she's interested in norms. I mean, she's interested in sort of sub-legal relationships that are, so that's a broader category, right?
But a broader consequential category, which I think often competes with or does identical work to the property law.
Oh, sure, and then this gets into debates about like formalization of title versus, you know, informal occupation. I mean, those are, and I think this is, you know, brought out by Ostrom's work that these are, the judgment between those two is going to be highly contextual. But I would see those operating as a form of property, a kind of informal property form, I guess is the way to put it. Maybe, you know, that squatters in the developing world may not have formal title recognized by the state, but they have a system of property that is functioning informally among themselves. It's a kind of law.
I'm sorry but I would just, the only other parting issue I would say is, except that implies a certain transferability which commoners might reject or dispute. And so that's why the discourse matters, or the categorization. It's not as if, oh, well, we'll just elide the commons into property.
But I think this is Rashmi's, because then some of those non-legal, some of those sort of, I don't know what to call them, like informal property-like arrangements, right? They can operate over here, like in a squatting camp where everyone has their own little parcel, or they can operate over here where we're talking about Ostrom's, you know, common pool resources or something that are, so I mean, the internal rules will determine where you fall on this spectrum. I mean, I see property in very generic terms as the sort of allocation of resources, you know, but it's the area of law, right, that's concerned with the allocation of resources. But, so that exists in a socialist system, it exists in a capitalist system. It's just who we identify as owners and how owners make decisions is going to vary in those different systems. But that may be part of why we're...
I wanted to follow up on the statement that was made about educational things that we can do to educate, and also the political question. So it seems to me that, you know, you kind of need to graduate beyond Hofeld and Ostrom and Demsetz into real estate finance, real estate development, land use, local government, legislation, and, you know, and really things that you are taking not just out of a sense of, oh, I'm interested in it, but I need to learn this. Because in order to learn it and speak it, if you bring the perspective that you speak, that, because what happens with these rules is through the complexity, they just seem so inevitable. And the thoughts behind them and the assumptions behind them seem inevitable. And so to bring the perspective that you bring in terms of, and I admit, based on a lot of time spent thinking about this, that there can be powerful things that happen through the tweaks in terms of how projects will be defined, who gets a cut, who gets thrown out, who gets included, and that the ability to know, to be able to speak the language in advance, because once those projects are off the ground, it's often too late. So I do think, I have thought about tax increment financing. What can you do to educate people? How can you make that comprehensible for people? So very simple things like that would actually, I think, be very powerful, because people literally have no idea what's going on. And by the time you get to the protest, that deal has already been structured, the banks are already in it, it's supposed to happen in a certain sequence and way, and they're too invested in order to change unless there's a political disruption, and there are other costs. So it just seems to me that more people need to be well-versed in how some of these things are actually put together. And that, that's a start.
There are more questions.
Great. Go ahead. Yeah.
I feel like the property seems very benign here. And I wanted to give an example that Marx uses in the primitive accumulation section of Capital. He talks about Edward Gibbon Wakefield. And Wakefield was working in Australia in the colonies. And Wakefield tells a story about how capitalism couldn't function properly in the colonies because people had land. And so they worked their land. And nobody had any incentive. Mr. Peel, the capitalist, comes over and he brings his factory equipment, et cetera, and he wants to set up a factory, but nobody joins him to work in the factory because there's no proletariat. And I think the interesting thing there is that what Marx tries to theorize throughout the whole of Capital is the disassociation of people from property. And so one concept of ownership that we haven't raised here is Veblen's concept of ownership, absentee ownership. And I think, so there's a lot of talk about property, but I feel like we're moving outside and inside of capitalist property relations. And if we talk more specifically about capitalist property relations, they involve absentee ownership. That's the key thing. So what's Wakefield's solution to the problem? You make land really expensive. If you make land expensive, then people spend a lot of time working to make that money to pay for the land, and they're stuck. So the mortgage is the kind of tool that we use to keep people in their place, in a sense. So even the mortgage, we have a house, but we don't own the house. The bank owns the house. So absentee ownership is the fundamental form of capitalist property relation. And that's what creates the inequality within the system. So I'd like you to respond more to that, because I feel like there's something very fundamental in capitalist property relations that isn't really coming to the surface in this conversation.
Could I grab a couple more hands before was there someone over here? Yes, go ahead.
Going back to the original comment about kind of freedom being a food and safety issue, I'm interested in some of the tools that you see within the ability to manipulate the bundle in order to provide greater security to people who might not otherwise have strong property rights in their own. I'm thinking, low-income tenants, people like that, rather than trying to kind of melt down and reforge the entire system. What are the ways that we can be working within the current system in order to provide greater security to the people who are most in need of it at the moment?
And then, did you have a comment or a question? Yeah.
What would you do to it seems to me that a lot of what's happening at the local real estate level, particularly with respect to regulations and zoning changes and so on, involves soft forms of corruption. And so what could you do to expose or make people aware of or bring to light soft forms of corruption so that people can become aware of the incentives of the people who are making decisions allegedly on their behalf? Because I think it's those kinds of incentive systems that are probably driving a lot of the misuse of land against sort of the so-called public interest.
Aisha, did you have a?
Just a quick comment about, we have comments all over the place right now, but just to go back to the issue of neoliberalism, because I think for a really long time we just had no idea what we were talking about. And I think I'm still a little bit confused, but how I would see it is like the way property law is taught now, it's like the things you look at are things like the first sort of the most important thing is alienability, right? How do you make sure land can immediately enter the market again? How do you make sure it's constantly in circulation? How can people buy it? how can they sell it, which makes me think neoliberal. Then I think of things like reasonable, what's the phrase, reasonable investment-backed expectations and tests like that, or the business judgment rules, stuff like that, which are becoming more and more sort of, you see them more and more frequently in property law textbooks, you see them more and more frequently in recent judgments that are coming out on property-related issues, which makes me once again think neoliberal, right? And at the same time, and every time you have like a competing rights-based argument that tries to counter this kind of stuff, it's always very much based on the individual agent, which is fetishized by the market economy, which is present within the context of neoliberalism. So when I think of neoliberal property regimes and what that would look like, these are the kind of things that I think of, which is very much what we are studying in a typical 1L property law class.
Who did you have for property?
Professor Singer? Yeah.
You think he's neoliberal?
Talk later.
You already got graded, right?
Do I think
You're on tape.
This is being recorded and broadcast, by the way. So,
I don't think he's progressive.
Wow.
But regardless, he has to teach the law as it. So any property scholar comes up.
By progressive, I don't think he is someone who teaches property as not from a radical viewpoint at all. Maybe progressive in a very liberal sense, which is like individual fairness and all that lovely stuff. He definitely does that perhaps more than other property law professors. But what I think of him as, would he be in Unbound when he was 24 at Harvard Law School? Probably not.
Almost certainly, but.
Ben, do you want to?
Then you get old.
You get old.
Yeah, I wanted
buy a house, you get a mortgage.
I want to take another crack at neoliberalism as well, because I think in the rhetoric is very much what Michael said: deregulation and privatization, deregulation, deteriorating the welfare state. But a lot of us were in Janet Halley's Foucault reading group and reading about the genealogy of neoliberalism through his eyes. And it seems from, at least in his eyes, a more sophisticated neoliberal sees the market as completely constructed by regulation. Mm-hmm. So their goal is to tick the rules to create a market that creates efficient outcomes and has perfect competition. And I think a huge goal, in that game that they create, they expect people to be sort of scraping by, and we need to make sure they're not dying, but it's okay that they're poor, because then they'll be motivated to work hard and rise up through the ranks. But I think a large part of this conference was thinking about how can we destroy that game so that people aren't scraping by, so they have time to engage in politics, to participate in like a real democratic society, a real political society. And in that spirit, I think thinking about things like entitlements or like making sure people can eat every day and have a place to sleep and have a job to support themselves and their family could be good ways to like tick the rules towards a more democratic or less neoliberal society. So, do you have ideas, or does anyone in this room have ideas about ticking property rules or any rules in ways that fight back against creating this game where inequality seems not only inevitable but desirable?
Okay, so can I take a crack at that? I think one way in which to make the confusion in this room feel less confusing, and we may not want to do that, but if we want to try to do that, if we want to walk away with a little more of a sense of coherence, one way to do it would be to acknowledge, as I would, that a good deal of the infrastructure of property law is currently existing to support neoliberalism as defined by Michael. But what I want to say, and I think what Eduardo is saying, and Audrey as well, is that property law as it currently exists, both on the books, including especially in places like New Jersey, but even, in other jurisdictions in the United States, is capacious enough to include those other visions. One of the questions that I wanted to put on the table is, why aren't we taking advantage of those other of that law that is not as visible to us, right? Maybe it's the rhetorical question. Maybe it's just that we feel absolutely sort of oppressed by the rhetoric that brings to the fore the infrastructure that supports neoliberalism. But it's not as if the rest of the infrastructure isn't there, right? It's not as if the rest of property law isn't still there and available to us. So we have to access it. And then the second thing I would say in response to that question, and it's so nice to get it 5 minutes before the end of this discussion so we actually know what we're talking about, 1 minute after the end of this discussion, is that while I would disagree that commons exist everywhere or that we see, opportunities all around us, what I would say is that probably in each major city, around this country, we have examples of non-neoliberal economic behavior. We have the sharing economy. We have worker-owned cooperatives. We have cooperatives gone wild in places like Cleveland, Ohio, right? We have, what else do we have? We have the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. We have limited equity co-ops in various settings. And we have New Jersey. We have tenants' rights in New Jersey. We have huge incursions on the law of trespass in the state of New Jersey and other amazing examples from New Jersey. And I think the question for us really does have to be in those specific contexts to map what it is about those economic relationships that's different from neoliberalism, and to think about the way property law works and needs to work. I realize this is an abstract answer, but it's 2 minutes after 5. The way in which it needs to work in which to enhance the flourishing of those relationships. So, in the context of Dudley Street, I would say that initial transfer of power of an eminent domain was really useful. In the context of worker-owned cooperatives in the city of Cleveland, I would say it's the acquisition of property interests and access along the sort of horizontally across various industries that seems to be incredibly useful. And if we spend some of our time less focused on the existential crisis that I think we've been having overmuch in this room, and instead really sort of mapping out those particular forms of property development and property use in those more limited local contexts, that we could really make some progress.
And Jacob actually said that it's probably only going to take him a few minutes to wrap up, so I would like to hear some closing comments from the other two panelists.
Go ahead.
Well, I had wanted to respond, I guess, to a few of the questions. I thought that the absentee ownership question was provocative in reminding us that, there are decisions to be made about whether or not we want to invest all of the rights and privileges of ownership to people who aren't exercising it in a way that should we treat all owners alike? Are you acting as an owner in all ways that require the same deference? And then there was a question about what are the ways to provide greater security to people through property. I think that is, I guess, a question that I've been wrestling with, which is it's really, we can talk about different doctrines and how we could conceive of different doctrines differently. So in an article I wrote, I played with, I was concerned about divestment of ownership of property through the subprime crisis and exploitative transactional relationships between repeat industry players, the brokers, and the poor black people, or just black people that were put into these destructive loans. And so there's all kinds of things we can play with and invest them with the meanings that we want, such as, the covenant of good faith and fair dealing, which is contractual and is viewed as something that says you won't mess up a contract while it's in performance. To apply that at the beginning of the transaction and to say during contract formation that there's an implied obligation to behave fairly towards your other transactional person you're negotiating with. To have a concept that a stick in the bundle is that you have a right to keep your property, and that there should be certain principles in place that protect you from being divested of your property involuntarily or unfairly. And so there's a lot of thinking that can be done around the existing principles, which arguably are done in a way to limit and don't serve the interests of all types of property owners. One of the things we also need to think about is whether or not we need more property or less. And I think that that's some of the conversation that's been going on here. Because right now, where we are, we've been hypnotized, brainwashed, again, we had widespread home ownership. So the language of property is very powerful. So do we need more property rights, more property claims? Do we need to declare ourselves as property again, which of course is very dangerous for someone like me. But because that property does, I think most people do have this sense that it is inviolable, that it is this individual absolute ownership, and that it provides protection. But it's a very persuasive claim. We respect people more who make a property claim. And so whether or not we find it destructive or beneficial to frame more of our political discourse to kind of get on the property bandwagon and to kind of present your argument in terms of property. And that might be a good short-term strategy because it flips the script. It's like, well, we can talk the talk and play it the way you do. How far that will go is, to be determined. And then the question about on the local level and the soft forms of corruption and how to address that. There is such a issue about the relationship of our government officials with to people with wealth, and kind of the imperative that municipal officials feel to attract people with wealth to their jurisdictions. And in some senses, a lot of what they do is to serve the interests of people with resources. And so I think people generally think or are aware of the kind of over-identification between our municipal and state government leaders with people with wealth. And so, the only antidote that we have for that is truly to bring a certain level of transparency to what's actually going on, because a lot of the deal, it's strange. A lot of people buy into a lot of what's going on. All you have to do is articulate jobs. And the conversation is over. Anything that is done in furtherance of producing jobs is considered, well, by any means necessary, make it happen. And so it just requires an actual awareness of, well, how many jobs are we talking about? Will that really happen? And what is the cost? So I do think that more participation is the only way to address that. But particularly participation, not just for participation's sake, but with a goal of what it is you're trying to accomplish, to achieve or obtain for the people or group of people that you are representing. So I don't see a silver bullet, but I do think that steeping yourself, the only way to counter the discourse is to learn it and then understand that it need not happen in the way that it's happening. That, as Duncan started us off with, it is completely socially constructed, and I do think you have to learn the talk in order to respond to the social construction.
I don't have a lot to add. I was thinking about, I was working on a paper on inequality and doing some reading on people's views on the estate tax, and it's funny that, there's widespread opposition to the estate tax, right? Even though, as it's operated forever, almost no one pays it, right? I mean, the estates that are covered by the estate tax are massive estates that, it's something like 2% of the population that would ever be impacted. And even when people understand that, they still oppose the estate tax. And they see it as somehow unfair or violating the idea of private ownership. I think one it's very interesting. I mean, I think one way that conservatives have been very effective is by claiming the mantle of ownership, right? And one way the left, I think, has been ineffective is by abdicating the mantle of ownership. So you talk about the confusion or conflation of family property and industrial property, right? But on the earlier panels, I heard a lot of just property, right? But that also conflates family property and industrial property. And there's an interesting, if you watch Eyes on the Prize, which is a great documentary about the civil rights movement, this gets back at the New Jersey rule, but there's a section that, of the documentary that focuses on 1960 sit-ins at the lunch counters, and it sort of interviews with white and black people, kind of their reactions to the, mostly there's this nice sequence of reaction among white Southerners who were opposed to the sit-ins, and one guy in particular, he says, because these are sit-ins at commercial establishments, right? And he says, well, in the South we have this tradition of the family meal, and you can come if you're invited, but if if someone tries to force themselves in on your family meal, people are gonna see you as doing something wrong. And we're talking about a sit-in at a lunch counter, right? And he's talking about the family meal. Like, that's the conflation of the two, right? In the direction of claiming, on behalf of what was largely corporate-owned property, the dignity or the importance, the sort of sanctity of this intimate personal property, right? And I think the right has been very effective at that. And it used to be in the 19th century, the left, right, framed a lot of their claims in terms of property rights, a kind of natural property rights. The groups like the National Reform Association, which was instrumental in enacting the Homestead Act, made these claims, and these were claims that were specifically kind of targeted at absentee ownership, right? These were claims on behalf of the sort of right of the people who are working the land, as again, now this is ignoring Native Americans, right? There are issues with this, but I'm just, the way it was framed was absentee owners, speculators are coming in to buy this, we should be entitled because we're the ones working the land. And they made the claims in Lockean terms of natural property rights. This is I think the dominant mode in which claims on the left were made through the 19th century and really into the industrial era, and so like in the sit-down strikes in the 1930s, workers sitting down and claiming an entitlement to have a say in the way factories were managed, made their claims in these same kind of terms that we have an ownership right in these factories because we're working in them. And if you employ kind of Lockean ideas about acquisition, we are creating value here as much as the owners of capital, and we're entitled to at least some say in how these enterprises are managed. That's how the arguments were made. And then something changes in the 20th century. By the time we get to, today certainly, but after the New Deal, it seems like the left, the claims start, the way in which they're made changes, and property becomes the obstacle, or the property, it's property ownership that's the enemy. And that's just, if you talk to the typical person on the street, that's not an appealing message, because they actually kind of want their, they want their little piece of ground, and they want their car, and they want, so if you're an opponent of property, you're an opponent of all that's sacred, you've just ceded all that ground to the right. Now you've allowed them to claim on behalf of, you have homogenized the category of private property, right, that necessarily, by implication, then extends to, by not extending to this sacred private home, or by not extending the dignity or the sort of importance to that concept, you have ceded to the right the power to kind of merge that with absentee-owned property or industrial property, and by reclaiming part of the property heritage, right, by framing things in terms of property rights, you and us, I mean, people on the left, I think, create the ability to drive that wedge between industrial property, corporate property, and individually owned property. Property is not the enemy, I guess, is my take on it. Property is instrumental to the solution. And it's not even a matter of reconceptualizing property. It's a matter of understanding that property is a valid human kind of aspiration, but that realizing that aspiration doesn't mean is not synonymous with neoliberalism. I just don't see it.
Great. I think that we've gotten some great thoughts through the day, and I'm going to turn it over to Jacob.